Time. Okay, it's saying live. I'm gonna copy this link. Okay, so I'm posting a new link to Twitter, and I'm gonna close Safari because I don't think that this can handle having two things at once. Just internet's not that great. So, Alice in Wonderland, Chapter 6, Pig and Pepper. For a minute or two she stood looking at the house and wondering what to do next, when suddenly a footman in a livery came running out of the wood. She considered him to be a footman because he was in a livery; otherwise, judging by his face only, she felt very curious to know what it was all about, and crept a little way out of the of the wood to listen. The fish footman began producing from under his arm a great letter, nearly as large as himself, and this he handed over to the other, saying in a solemn tone, "For the Duchess, an invitation from the Queen to play croquet." The frog footman repeated, in the same solemn tone, only changing the order of the words a little, "From the Queen, an invitation for the Duchess to play croquet." They both bowed low, and the curls got entangled together. Alice laughed so much at this she had to run back into the wood for fear of their hearing her, and when she next peeped out, the fish footman was gone, and the other was sitting on the ground near the door, staring stupidly up into the sky. Alice went timidly up to the door and knocked. "There's no sort of use in knocking," said the footman, "and that for two reasons. First, because I'm on the same side of the door as you are. Secondly, because they're making such noise inside, no one could possibly hear you." And certainly there was a most extraordinary noise going on within, a constant howling and sneezing, and every now and then a great crash, as if a dish or kettle had been broken to pieces. "Please, then," said Alice, "how am I to get in?" "There might be some sense in your knocking," the footman went on, without attending to her, "if we had the door between us. For instance, if you were inside, you might knock, and I could let you out, you know." He was looking up at the sky all the time he was speaking, and this Alice thought decidedly uncivil. "But perhaps he can't help it," she said to herself. "His eyes are so very near the top of his head. But at any rate he might answer the questions." "How am I to get in?" she repeated aloud. "I shall sit here," the footman said, "till tomorrow." At this moment the door of the house opened, and a large plate came skimming out, straight at the footman's head. It just grazed his nose, and broke the two pieces against one of the trees behind him. "Or the next day, maybe," the footman continued in the same tone, exactly as if nothing had happened. "How am I to get in?" asked Alice, louder. "Are you to get in at all?" said the footman. "That's the first question, you know." It was, no doubt. Only Alice did not like to be told so. "It's really dreadful," she muttered to herself, "the way all the creatures argue. It's enough to drive one crazy." The footman seemed to think this a good opportunity for repeating his remark with variations. "I shall sit here," he said, "on and off, for days and days." "But what am I to do?" said Alice. "Anything you like," said the footman, and he began whistling. "Oh, there's no use talking to him," said Alice desperately. "He's perfectly idiotic." And she opened the door and went in. The door led into a large kitchen, which was full of smoke from one end to the other. The Duchess was sitting on a three-legged stool in the middle, nursing a baby. The cook was leaning over the fire, stirring a large cauldron, which seemed to be full of soup. "There's certainly too much pepper in that soup," Alice said to herself, as well as she could for sneezing. There was certainly too much of it in the air. Even the Duchess sneezed occasionally, and as for the baby, it was sneezing and howling alternately, without a moment's pause. The only two creatures in the kitchen that did not sneeze were the cook and a large cat, which was lying on the hearth and grinning from ear to ear. "Please, would you tell me," said Alice a little timidly, for she was not quite sure whether it was good manners for her to speak first. "Why, your cat grins like that?" "It's a Cheshire cat," said the Duchess, "and that's why." "I didn't know Cheshire cats always grinned," said Alice. "In fact, I didn't know cats could grin." "They all can," said the Duchess, "and most of 'em do." "I don't know of any that do," said Alice very politely, feeling quite pleased to have got into a conversation. "You don't know much," said the Duchess, "and that's a fact." Alice did not at all like the tone of this remark, and thought it would be just as well to introduce some other subject of conversation. While she was trying to fix on one, the cook took the cauldron off the soup of fire, and at once set to work throwing everything within her reach, and the Duchess and the baby. The fire pans came first, then followed a shower of saucepans and plates and dishes. The Duchess took no notice of them even when they hit her, and the baby was howling so much it was quite impossible to say whether the blows hurt it or not. "Oh, please mind what you're doing!" cried Alice, jumping up and down in an agony of terror. "Oh, there goes his precious nose!" as an unusually large saucepan flew close by it, and very nearly carried it off. "If everyone minded their own business," the Duchess said in a hoarse growl, "the world would go round a great deal faster than it does." "Which would not be an advantage," said Alice, who felt very glad to get an opportunity of showing off a little of her knowledge. "Just think what it would make without day or night. You could see the earth takes 24 hours to turn on its axis." "Talking of axes," said the Duchess, "chop off her head." Alice glanced rather anxiously at the cook to see if she meant to take the hint, but the cook was busily stirring the soup and seemed not to be listening, so she went on again. "24 hours, I think, or is it 12?" "Oh, don't bother me," said the Duchess. "I could never abide figures." And with that she began nursing her child again, singing a sort of lullaby to it as she did so, and giving it a violent shake at the end of every line. "Speak roughly to your little boy, and beat him when he sneezes. He only does it to annoy, because he knows it teases." Chorus, in which the baby and the cook joined. Wow, wow, wow! While the Duchess sang the second verse of the song, she kept tossing the baby violently up and down, and the poor little thing howled so that Alice could hardly hear. "I speak severely to my boy, I beat him when he sneezes, for he can thoroughly enjoy the pepper when he pleases." Wow, wow, wow! "Here, you may nurse it for a bit if you like," the Duchess said to Alice, flinging the baby at her as she spoke. "I must go and get ready to play croquet with the Queen." And she hurried off out of the room. The cook threw a frying pan after her as she went, but it just missed her. Alice caught the baby with some difficulty, as it was a queer-shaped little creature, and held out its arms and legs in all directions. "Just like a starfish," thought Alice. The poor little thing was snorting up like a steam engine when she caught it, and kept doubling itself over and straightening itself out again, so that altogether, for the first minute or two, it was as much as she could do to hold it. As soon as she had made out the proper way of nursing it, which was to twist it up in a sort of knot, and then keep tight hold of its right ear and left foot, so as to prevent it from undoing itself, she carried it out into the open air. "If I don't take this child away with me," thought Alice, "they're sure to kill it in a day or two. Wouldn't it be murder to leave it behind?" She said the last word out loud, and the little thing grunted in reply. It had left off sneezing by this time. "Don't grunt," said Alice. "That's not at all a proper way of expressing yourself." The baby grunted again, and Alice looked very anxiously into its face to see what was the matter with it. There could be no doubt it had a very turned-up nose, much more like a snout than a real nose. Also, its eyes were getting extremely small for a baby. Altogether, Alice did not like the look of the thing at all. But perhaps it was only sobbing, she thought, and looked into its eyes again to see if there were any tears. No, there were no tears. "If you are going to turn into a pig, my dear," said Alice seriously, "I'll have nothing more to do with you. Mind now!" The poor little thing sobbed again, or grunted, it was impossible to say which, and they went on for some time in silence. Alice was just beginning to think to herself, "Now, what am I going to do with this creature when I get home?" when it grunted again so violently that she looked down to see its face in some alarm. This time there could be no mistake at all. It was neither more or less than a pig, and she felt that it would be quite absurd for her to carry it any further. So she set the little creature down, and felt quite relieved to see it trot away quietly into the wood. If it had grown up, she said to herself, it would have made a dreadfully ugly child, but it makes a rather handsome pig, I think. And she began thinking over the other children she knew who might do very well as pigs, and was just saying to herself, if one only knew the right way to change them, when she was a little startled by seeing a Cheshire cat sitting on a bough of a tree a few yards off. The cat only grinned when it saw Alice. It looked good-natured, she thought. Still, it had very long claws and a great many teeth, and so she felt it ought to be treated with respect. Cheshire Puss, she began timidly, as she did not at all know if it would like the name. However, it only grinned a little wider. Come, it's pleased so far, thought Alice, and she went on. Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? That depends a good deal on where you want to go, said the cat. I don't much care where, said Alice. Then it doesn't matter which way you go, said the cat. Just so long as I get somewhere, Alice added as an explanation. Oh, you're sure to do that, said the cat, if you only walk long enough. Alice felt this could not be denied, so she tried another question. What sort of people live about here? In that direction, the cat said, waving its right paw around, lives a hatter, and in that direction, waving the other paw, lives a March hare. Visit either you like. They're both mad. But I don't want to go among mad people, Alice remarked. Oh, you can't help that, said the cat. We're all mad here. I'm mad. You're mad. How do you know I'm mad? Said Alice. You must be mad, said the cat, or you wouldn't have come here. Alice didn't think that proved it at all. However, she went on, and how do you know that you're mad? To begin with, said the cat, a dog's not mad. You grant that? I suppose so, said Alice. Well, then, the cat went on, you see, a dog growls when it's angry and wags its tail when it's pleased. Now, I growl when I'm pleased and wag my tail when I'm angry. Therefore, I'm mad. I call it purring, not growling. Call it what you like, said the cat. Do you play croquet with the Queen today? I should like it very much, said Alice, but I haven't been invited yet. You'll see me there, said the cat, and vanished. Alice was not much surprised at this, and she was getting used to the queer things happening. While she was still looking at the place where it had been, it suddenly appeared again. By the by, what became of the baby? Said the cat. I'd nearly forgotten to ask. It turned into a pig, Alice answered, very quietly, just as if the cat had come back the natural way. I thought it would, said the cat, and vanished again. Alice waited a little, half expecting to see it again, but it did not appear, and after a minute or two she walked on in the direction of which the March hare was said to live. I've seen hatters before, she said to herself. The March hare will be the most interesting, and perhaps, as this is May, it won't be raving mad, at least not so mad as it was in March. As she said this, she looked up. There was the cat again, sitting on the branch of a tree. Did you say pig or fig? I said pig, replied Alice, and I wish you wouldn't keep appearing and vanishing so suddenly. You make one quite giddy. All right, said the cat, and this time it vanished quite slowly, beginning with the end of the tail and ending with the grin, which remained some time after the rest of it had gone. Well, I've seen a cat without a grin, thought Alice, but a grin without a cat is the most curious thing I ever saw in all my life. She had not gone much farther before she came in sight of the house of the March hare. She thought it must be the right house, because all the chimneys were shaped like ears, and the roof was thatched with fur. It was so large a house that she did not like to go nearer till she had nibbled more of the left-hand bit of the mushroom and raised herself to about 2 feet high. Even then she walked up towards it timidly, saying to herself, suppose it should be raving mad after all. I almost wish I'd gone to see the Hatter instead. Turn it over to you real quick. Just got this out at random, also. I have to show up my collection of Alice in Wonderland merch another time. Chapter 7. A Mad Tea Party. There was a table set out under a tree in front of the house, and the March Hare and the Hatter were having tea at it. A dormouse was sitting between them, fast asleep, and the other two were using it as a cushion, resting their elbows on it, and talking over its head. Very uncomfortable for the dormouse, thought Alice, only as it's asleep, I suppose it doesn't mind. The table was a large one, and the three were all crowded together at the corner of it. No room, no room! They cried when they saw Alice coming. There's plenty of room, Alice said indignantly, and she sat down in a large armchair at one end of the table. Have some wine, the March Hare said in an encouraging tone. Skip page. Alice looked all round the table, but there was nothing on it but tea. I don't see any wine, she remarked. There isn't any, said the March Hare. Then it wasn't very civil of you to offer it, said Alice angrily. It wasn't very civil of you to sit down without being invited, said the March Hare. I didn't know it was your table, said Alice. It's laid for a great many more than three. Your hair wants cutting, said the Hatter. He had been looking at Alice for some time with great curiosity, eyes wide on hearing this, but all he said was, Why is a raven like a writing desk? Come, we shall have some fun now, thought Alice. I'm glad they've begun asking riddles. I believe I can guess that, she added aloud. Do you mean you think you can find out the answer to it? Said the March Hare. Exactly so, said Alice. Then you should say what you mean, the March Hare went on. I do, Alice hastily replied. At least, I mean what I say. That's the same thing, you know. Not the same thing a bit, said the Hatter. Why, you might just as well say, I see what I eat is the same thing as I eat what I see. You might just as well say, added the March Hare, that I like what I get is the same thing as I get what I like. You might just as well say, added the Dormouse, who seemed to be talking in its sleep. Oh, let me start that one over. You might just as well say, added the Dormouse, who seemed to be talking in its sleep, that I breathe when I sleep is the same thing as I sleep when I breathe. It is the same with you, said the Hatter, and here the conversation dropped, and the party sat silent for a minute, while Alice thought over all she could remember about ravens and writing desks, which wasn't much. The Hatter was the first to break the silence. What day of the month is it? He said, turning to Alice. He had taken his watch out of his pocket, and was looking at it uneasily, shaking it every now and then and holding it to its ear. Alice considered it a little, then said, The 4th. 2 days wrong, said the Hatter. I told you butter wouldn't suit the works, he added, looking angrily at the March Hare. It was the best butter, the March Hare meekly replied. Yes, but some crumbs must have got in as well, the Hatter grumbled. You shouldn't have put it in with the bread knife. The March Hare took the watch and looked at it gloomily. Sorry. Then he dipped it in his cup of tea and looked at it again. But he could think of nothing better to say than his first mark. It was the best butter, you know. Alice had been looking over his shoulder with some curiosity. What a funny watch, she remarked. It tells the day of the month and doesn't tell what clock it is. Why should it? Muttered the Hatter. Does your watch tell you what year it is? Of course not, Alice replied very readily. But that's because it stays the same year for such a long time altogether. Which is just the case with mine, said the Hatter. Alice felt dreadfully puzzled. The Hatter's remark seemed to her to have no sort of meaning to it, and yet it was certainly English. I don't quite understand you, she said as politely as she could. Dormouse is asleep again, said the Hatter, and he poured a little hot tea upon its nose. The Dormouse shook its head impatiently and said without opening its eyes, Of course, just what I was going to remark myself. Have you guessed the riddle yet? The Hatter said, turning to Alice again. No, I give it up, Alice replied. What's the answer? I haven't the slightest idea, said the Hatter. Nor I, said the March Hare. Alice sighed wearily. I think you might do something better with your time, she said, than wasting it on asking riddles that have no answers. "If you knew time as well as I do," said the Hatter, "you wouldn't talk about wasting it. It's him." "I don't know what you mean," said Alice. "Of course you don't," the Hatter said, tossing his head contemptuously. "I dare say you never spoke to time." "Perhaps not," Alice cautiously replied, "but I know I have to beat time when I learn music." "Ah, that accounts for it," said the Hatter. "He won't stand beating. Now, if you only kept on good terms with him, he'd do almost anything you liked with the clock. For instance, suppose it were 9 o'clock in the morning, just the time to begin lessons. You'd only have to whisper a hint at time, and round goes clock in a twinkling. 1:30, time for dinner." "I only wish it was," the March Hare said to itself in a whisper. "That would be grand, certainly," said Alice thoughtfully. "But then I shouldn't be hungry for it, you know." "Not at first," said the Hatter, "but you could keep it at 1:30 as long as you liked." "Is that the way you manage?" Alice asked. The Hatter shook his head mournfully. "Not I," he replied. "We quarreled last March, just before he went mad, you know," pointing his teaspoon at the March Hare, "and it was a great concert given by the Queen of the Hearts, and I had to sing, 'Twinkle, twinkle, little bat, how I wonder what you're at.' You know the song, perhaps?" "I've heard something like it," said Alice. "It goes on, you know," the Hatter said, in this way: "Up above the world so high, like a tea tray in the sky, twinkle, twinkle." Here the Dormouse shook itself and began singing in its sleep, "Twinkle, twinkle, 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 twinkle," and went on so long they had to pinch it to make it stop. "Well, I'd hardly finished the first verse," said the Hatter, when the Queen bawled out, "He's murdering the time off with his head." "How dreadfully savage!" exclaimed Alice. "And ever since that," the Hatter went on in a mournful tone, "he won't do a thing I ask. It's always 6 o'clock now." A bright idea came into Alice's head. "Is that the reason so many tea things are put out here?" she asked. "Yes, that's it," said the Hatter with a sigh. "It's always tea time. We've no time to wash things between whiles." "And you keep moving round, I suppose?" said Alice. "Exactly so," said the Hatter, "as the things get used up." "But what happens when you come to the beginning again?" Alice ventured to ask. "Suppose we change the subject," the March Hare interrupted, yawning. "I'm getting tired of this. I vote the young lady tell us a story." "I'm afraid I don't know one," said Alice, rather alarmed. "Then the Dormouse shall," they both cried. "Wake up, Dormouse!" And they pinched it on both sides at once. The Dormouse slowly opened its eyes. "I wasn't asleep," it said in a hoarse, feeble voice. "I heard every word you fellows were saying." "Tell us a story," said the March Hare. "Yes, please do," pleaded Alice. "And be quick about it," added the Hatter, "or you'll be asleep again before it's done." "Once upon a time there were three little sisters," the Dormouse began in a great hurry, "and their names were Elsie, Lacy, and Tilly, and they lived at the bottom of a well." "What did they live on?" said Alice, who took a great interest in questions of eating and drinking. "They lived on treacle," said the Dormouse, after thinking a minute or two. "They couldn't have done that, you know," Alice gently remarked. "They'd have been ill." "So they were," said the Dormouse. "Very ill." Alice tried a little to fancy herself on what an extraordinary way of living would be like, but it puzzled her too much, and she went on. "But why did they live at the bottom of a well?" "Take some more tea," the Hare said to Alice very earnestly. "I've had nothing yet," Alice replied in an offended tone, "so I can't take more." "You mean you can't take less," said the Hatter. "It's very easy to take more than nothing." Who's making person Oh, sorry, I skipped a line. "Nobody asked your opinion," said Alice. "Who's making personal remarks now?" the Hatter asked triumphantly. Alice did not quite know what to say to this, so she helped herself to some tea and bread and butter, and she then turned to the Dormouse and repeated her question. "Why did they live at the bottom of a well?" The Dormouse took a minute or two to think about it, and then said, "It was a treacle well." "There's no such thing!" Alice would be very angrily, but the Hatter and the March Hare went, "Shh, shh," and the Dormouse sulkily remarked, "If you can't be civil, you'd better finish the story yourself." "No, please go on," Alice said very humbly. "I won't interrupt you again. I dare say there may be one." One indeed, said the Dormouse indignantly. However, he consented to go on. And so these three little sisters, they were learning to draw, you know. What did they draw? Said Alice, quite forgetting her promise. Treacle, said the Dormouse, without considering at all this time. I want a clean cup, interrupted the Hatter. Let's all move one place on. He moved on as he spoke, and the Dormouse followed him. The March Hare moved in the Dormouse's place, and Alice rather unwillingly took the place of the March Hare. The Hatter was the only one who got any advantage from the change, and Alice was a good deal worse off than before, as the March Hare had just upset the milk jug onto his plate. Alice did not wish to offend the Dormouse again, so she began very cautiously, "But I don't understand. Where did they draw the treacle from?" "You can draw water out of a well," said the Hatter. "So I should think you can draw treacle out of a well, eh, stupid?" "But they were in the well," Alice said to the Dormouse, choosing not to notice this last remark. "Of course they were," said the Dormouse. "Well in." This answer so confused poor Alice that she let the Dormouse go for some time without interrupting it. "Everything that begins with M. Why with an M?" said Alice. "Why not?" said the March Hare. Alice was silent. The Dormouse closed its eyes by this time, and was going off into a doze. But, on being pinched by the Hatter, it woke up again with a little shriek, and went on, "That begins with an M, such as mouse-traps, and the moon, and memory, and muchness. You know, they say such things are much of muchness. Did you ever see such a drawing of muchness?" "Really now, if you ask me," said Alice, very much confused, "I don't think—" "Then you shouldn't talk," said the Hatter. This piece of rudeness was more than Alice could bear. She got up in great disgust, and walked off. The Dormouse fell asleep instantly, and neither one of the others took the least notice of her going, though she looked back once or twice, half hoping they would call after her. This last time she saw them, they were trying to put the Dormouse into the teapot. "At any rate, I'll never go there again," said Alice, as she picked her way through the wood. "It's the stupidest tea party I was ever at in all my life." Just as she said this, she noticed that one of the trees had a door leading right to it. "That's very curious," she thought, "but everything's curious today. I think I may as well go in at once." And in she went. Once more she found herself in the long hall, and close to the little glass table. "Now we'll manage better this time," she said to herself, and began by taking the gold key and unlocking the door that led into the garden. Then she set to work, nibbling at the mushroom. She had to keep a piece of it in her pocket, till she was about a foot high. Then she walked down the little passage, and then she found herself at last in the beautiful garden, among the bright flower beds and cool fountains. And I think that is a good stopping point. That plus the other chapter puts us at chapter 8. Does anybody want me to read the next chapter? Would it be better to wait till next time? Also, hey, I'm seeing the chat now. I was purposely not looking at it. Go on, yes, no? And this can have a little bit of lag, so. Yay, nay? So I'm thinking that is a good stopping point. It's right before. You're welcome. So I think we're agreeing that that is a good stopping point. Alice is about to have croquet with the queen. This will resume on Monday, as it is Friday now, and go until we finish the book. There's a poll on my Twitter for the next book. Oh man, that actually sounds really good. I haven't had that yet. So, yeah. Thank you guys for stopping by. Can't offer much, but I can do this. So, okay.